Now, we're talking about flats built more than 30 or even 40 years ago.
I want the project to go through.
Janganlah buat renovation tapi suruh kita pindah mana-mana, duduk mana, memang diorang tak ada tempat tinggal, susah lah.
Lagi bagus pihak kerajaan datang bincang.
Yelah, sebab kita dah biasa suasana tu kan.
This would be my terms.
Hello everyone, you're watching Beyond the Headlines, the go-to space for the top stories that made the headlines and more. My name is Amalina Kamal, guiding you through this latest round of Information Digest. Now today, we're diving into a topic that's sparking real conversations at the grassroots level, the proposed Urban Renewal Act, or as many will call it, URA. Now the Urban Renewal Act is a bold move by the Housing and Local Government Ministry. It aims to give old, neglected flats and apartments a new lease of life. Now, we're talking about flats built more than 30 or even 40 years ago, where lifts don't work, roofs leak, and basic maintenance is a real struggle. Now, the URA wants to fix that, but not with a paint job, but with a total redevelopment. At the heart of this bill, of course, is a big promise. No homeowner will be left behind. Now, the government says your rights and your roof over your head will be protected. However, urban planners and property experts have also raised key questions. Who qualifies to be a developer under this scheme? How will maintenance fees be regulated so they don't become a burden for low-income families? And of course, what role will the Housing Tribunal play when disputes arise? Now, sharing his insights with us is real estate strategist and property expert Previndran Singhe. Welcome, Previndran, to Beyond the Headlines. Okay, Previndran, now the URA is a legislative initiative by the Malaysian government aimed at rejuvenating aging and deteriorating urban areas. Of course, its primary goals are to enhance living conditions, optimize land use, and address urban decay by facilitating the redevelopment because in KL itself, land scarcity limits new developments. Now, I want to ask this. How can we ensure that urban renewal projects do not unintentionally lead to gentrification?
Yeah, so that's, I think, the grouse of many from the profession is that, number one, this project shouldn't be identified in the Act. Actually, if the government intends to do it, these projects need to be mooted by those people who are in these areas, right? So let's say, because now it's being identified through the Act itself, right? I think they've got 100 over or 200 over projects, 300 over projects, or whatever the number is. But I think it should be identified by the people in those developments, right? And the minimum percentage is already allowed for 80%, 75%, that, they can moot it. So that's number one, right? Because then they actually say, I want the project to go through. This would be my terms, and then it goes through the process. I think another thing we really need to look at is also, yes, proper compensation. I think that has always been clear. But I also think the proper compensation is if in event that the same people that want to live in the new regenerated area to prevent gentrification is to ensure that they actually can afford to live in that area. Because the fear is, look, I'm going to take over, I'm going to put 30 stories, brand new condos, etc. The problem is going to be the service charge, the maintenance fees, right? So as much as the Act is actually very noble, I think Malaysia is really in need of the Act. I think the process needs to be thought through much more clearer. There needs to be engagement with various communities, right? The communities that are going to be regenerated, the developments that are, how are we going to compensate them? How do we manage if they stay on? How are we going to mitigate the risk of them not being able to pay the service charges, and then at the end of the day lose that property that was actually the source of this regeneration, right? Because they can't pay, it could be auctioned. What's probably lack of clarity or transparency is that, okay, this is the building that's going to do it, right? Then this is the place that we want to identify. Okay, you identified. Is there going to be a proper tender? Is there going to be performance bond? How is the compensation going to take place? So many unanswered questions.
Now, just to reiterate your point, you're talking about the compensation not being solely based on having to value the property market rate at the time. We should also consider social as well as emotional considerations for long-standing Communities.
That's why the percentage is very important, right? If majority of them agree to it, that means they want something new to get going already, right? They want a newer property. They understand that, you know, it's safety, health, family, community is all disappearing in that old structure, right? I am not against that. I think that is it's actually a fantastic act. My concern is the process. I'm sorry to go back to that again and again, right? It is only if we can fully detail and itemize every step of the way in the act to safeguard the rakyat, the people. Your first question to me about the gentrification and impacting the people where the URA is going to be implemented on, right? You only can do that if it really is detailed down and all stakeholders engage. Or not, it's going, I mean, I can potentially see it being abused.
Now, the burning question here is what mechanisms can actually be put in place to prevent a spike in maintenance charges post-redevelopment?
I think there's two parts to this, right? I think the first part is if the existing resident is going to be placed back into the same development with a higher service charge, that needs to be addressed. How do we calculate the share of their contributions into it? That's the first part, right? The second part is very critical, right? And that's why we have property managers. That's why we have the Strata Management Act. And these two need to be enforced, right? So I think that's very critical as well. Look, it's been done. There is a housing tribunal, right? But we need enforcement. It can be done. It's just that enforcement needs to be addressed. I'll need to digress a little bit if you don't mind, right? There is a decision by KPKT to also start mooting a different body for building managers, which then developers can be, it comes under KPKT. Now property managers are under the Minister of Finance because we are independent and we are responsible fiscally and responsible legally to the residents and the client, the JMB or the MC. Now, can you imagine that the whole process now, the development is done by the developer and the developer's property manager is managing it as well. There's an immediate conflict of interest.
Okay, Previndran, the bill proposes majority consent threshold based on building age. Now, how can we actually ensure that this consent is genuinely informed and not influenced by pressures from developers or management bodies?
You mentioned it very clearly, right? You don't want the pressure from the developers. So that's why I suggested there should be a steering committee or an outfit from the government engaging with the residents and saying, hey, look, this is going to be done. We need to regenerate. This is the plan. Then go for tender. Then go and tender and look for the developer, number one, to make sure it doesn't get abandoned. Number two, has the capacity to complete and to compensate the residents. And thirdly, to ensure that when the residents come back, there is a mechanism for them to sustain their lives there. So let's say now, you know, we've agreed, okay, yes, Mr. Government, we are agreeable to the Urban Renewal Act. So what's the next stage? The next stage is to go through a tender, right? Where or go through a system where the residents can evaluate whether it's proper for them, whether we are getting the proper compensation, what's going to happen here, right? Is it, you know, tearing down or, you know, renovating a residential building and converting it to some other use that might not be congruent to what the residents who have been living there for a long time. So that's what I said, you know, I think it should be led not by saying, okay, this is the area we want, this is the developers that are going to do it, and this is what we're going to build. I think that's wrong. And we need clarity on that. What is the process? How is this going to go through?
But we have to be fair. We have to be fair to the government, or at least hold space for them to at least have this initiative in redeveloping certain dilapidated areas, right? Would introducing community representation or advisory councils in the planning and execution level ensure transparency?
If you ask me, for me, of course, track record, capacity to complete, ability to actually engage with all stakeholders. I mean, these would be the three very important issues. But track record, capacity to complete. What you don't want is a regeneration project or an urban renewal project that is stalled. I'll say it again, I'm a big supporter of URA, but my only concern is all these issues. In terms of the percentage, I'm fine with it. I think that's great. It's a good start. We need it. But there should be an allowance that residents can moot it themselves, right? If let's say I'm in a building, it's 30 years old, hey, 80%, let's go. Then we can do it ourselves, right? Or we can sell it to a developer, we can do a tender. But even if that happens, there needs to be an oversight by the government to ensure that the person who takes it has the capacity to complete. Your question on defect liability, on whether it should be itemized in the URA, actually that would come under the Housing Developers Act. But I think it's pertinent to note, and I'm correlating this to my comment on enforcement. The Housing Developers Act under KPKT is great. It's got all the laws in place, but implementation is key. Just look at the amount of abandoned projects, right, that's taking place. So we really need enforcement and implementation of the Act to actually ensure none of this happens.
Right, powerful insights there on the promise as well as pitfalls of the Urban Renewal Act. Thank you so much, Previndran, again for joining us. That is what an expert had to say. But what do everyday Malaysians think about the idea of it? We hit the streets to find out how the public is reacting to URA, and here's what they had to say.
The government's proposed Urban Renewal Act is gaining traction among residents of aging flats, many of whom see it as a long overdue opportunity to breathe new life into deteriorating housing conditions.
Kebanyakan kita tengok flat-flat banyak yang dah cat tercabut apa semua kan. Seeloknya kita cat balik apa semua.
Kebanyakan diorang macam dah pencen duduk flat, diorang tak nak, diorang beli rumah baru, pindah kampung ke.
Residential blocks, some decades old, have faced structural wear and tear, limited accessibility, and poor maintenance. The URA aims to address these challenges through comprehensive redevelopment plans that improve quality of life. However, as discussions continue, residents are calling greater transparency in the planning.
Ada juga kalau nak kata risau tu, ialah sebab kita dah biasa suasana tu kan. Contohlah anda kata kalau dia nak suruh kita pindah pun, biarlah berdekatan yang senang lah orang cakap kan.
Lagi bagus pihak kerajaan datang bincang dengan orang-orang yang penduduk ni lagi bagus. Kita tanya keadaan macam mana flat, nak ketambahan apa.
Bagi saya tak adalah kalau nak buat renovation ke apa, nak cantikkan flat ni, dia ada bagikan penempatan yang selesa untuk kita orang. Baiklah untuk orang semua, tak ada masalah kot. Janganlah buat renovation tapi suruh kita pindah mana-mana, duduk mana, memang diorang tak ada tempat tinggal, susah lah.
Cadangan saya seeloknya biarlah yang kerajaan yang uruskan kan. Tapi kalau boleh subkon tu dia nak cari subkon, biar subkon yang betul-betul. Jangan menyusahkan rakyat je lah.
Well, the Urban Renewal Act is of course still a work in progress. One thing's clear though, how we rebuild our cities says a lot about the future we want to live in. Balancing development with dignity, progress with protection, that's the real challenge. Unfortunately, that's the time that we have for today for this particular episode. If you like this particular episode, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Don't forget to also turn on the notification bell if you haven't already. You'll not only get Beyond the Headlines update, other NSC Online's news report will be delivered to you. My name is Amalina Kamal and I'll see you next week.